So, welcome everyone to the Centrist YouTube channel. My guest today is author Thomas Cromwell, who was born on a Christian communal farm in, how do you say that? Shropshire, England? Is that right?
Shropshire.
Sh-
Shropshire.
Shropshire, England.
Hmm.
And Thomas moved to America at age 14. He spent 25 years in the Middle East as a journalist, publisher, and peace builder, studying the monotheistic faiths in their homelands and working to promote an understanding among the diverse communities in the region. He traveled throughout the communist world before the fall of the Soviet Union, learning his learning firsthand about life under Marxist regimes. His work and curiosity about human civilization have taken him to 130 countries so far. So how, before we start talking about the subject today, which is, Ukraine and what's happening in Ukraine, what was it like being a Middle East journalist?
Well, if you look at world news, so much of it comes from the Middle East because it's such a region of conflicts, of problems that have repercussions across the world. I think partly because it's, the birthplace of the three great monotheistic religions. So that's a certain level at which it draws attention continuously from around the world. But just geopolitically, it's so hot, it's so significant. Oil, its position between Africa and Asia and Europe. So all of these kind of critical factors make it very important. And what makes it interesting, of course, is the cultural dynamics and the diversity in the region. Um, it's an interplay of obviously of politics, religion, and sort of international relations all kind of intersect. You look at a country like Lebanon, for example, where you had like a perfect storm of those forces interacting to actually destroy the country in the civil war. In a sense, Lebanon has always been a microcosm of the diversity and the problems in the region, but also the potential, the potential for wealth, for success, for importance, for education, all the other good things. So it's a region rich in life.
It is. Um, I can't imagine having traveled to 130 countries. So this has been a tremendous part of your life. What got Ukraine on your radar?
It was one of the countries I sort of got to later in my life. And what I was doing primarily after working intensively in the Middle East for 25 years was nation branding, helping countries present themselves and communicate their agendas to key audiences around the world. And eventually that took me to Ukraine. So I did two or three significant reports. I did two reports in the Washington Post magazine, 12-page reports about Ukraine, kind of overviews of the country, some of the political, economic, and cultural phenomena.
Mm.
I spent time in Crimea, in some of the major cities in the western part. So yeah, I got to know the country fairly well.
So, what is your impression? What's your overall impression about Ukraine and its importance to the globe, to the world?
I think all of the former Soviet republics have to be looked at in the context of that past they're emerging from. First of all, one thing the Soviet Union did was submerge individual country identities, and obviously they had limited independence uh, or autonomy. I think autonomy is a better term than independence. So that colored, the Soviet regime colored the reality in all those countries. So as they emerged, after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, part of each of their agendas has been to identify itself, to separate itself from the rest of the countries, to create their own identity and establish their own positions in the world. And Ukraine is a particularly significant country in that respect. It has its own rich history. It has probably the best agricultural soil in the world, and that's been part of its important identity. But also, it suffered enormously under the Soviet Union, famously during the Holodomor, where as many as 6 million Ukrainian kulaks were killed under Stalin's regime. And they were invaded during World War II by the Nazis, so they became a battleground. Ukraine became a battleground between the German and Soviet armies. So they've suffered tremendously. But generally, I found the people of Ukraine to be fine, to be generally well educated, intelligent, forward-looking, trying to improve themselves. At the time I was there was still a fairly deep division, with a large portion of the population being closely affiliated with Russia. They spoke Russian as their first language. This is more in the east and the south, in Crimea, for example. And many of them expressed the desire to be part of Russia at that time. Of course, all of that has changed with the invasion by Putin. That percentage has gone way down. It's less than 10%, far less than 10% at this point. Ukraine has become firmly oriented towards the West. It wants to join the European Union. It wants to join NATO. And that's where it sees its destiny. So when I was there a decade or so ago in particular, this was the big kind of debate within the country. Do we go with the West? And different leaders would go in different directions. Like Yushchenko was very pro-Western. Yanukovych was very pro-Russia. And so the country was kind of torn, not only because of, linguistic differences, but mainly between the West and the East, but also in terms of these sentimental attachments, I would say.
I noticed that when I was there last year, the thought had occurred to me how much influence the young people, that are coming up because have on direction that they want to go, which is definitely towards the European Union and the Western direction. They are educated. And I found them to be just a beautiful society. And now that they're fighting, it's they are a fierce people as well. But I think that in the West, and this is going to lead us into some of the things we want to talk about in terms of moral equivalency and containment and these other theories that we want to talk about. I think Americans generally don't realize that Ukraine is full of young people who want a life of self-determination. They want to go in the direction that they want to go, and that's freedom. They don't want to live under an old repressive regime. And so it was disturbing to me when after Putin, invaded Ukraine in February, that there was this idea that, well, Ukraine is just as bad as Russia, and it's not really a very good nation, and we can just kick it to the curb, and it's not going to matter, to the rest of the globe if they have freedom, that they should just, take the knee to Putin, because that's really basically the easiest thing for us. And you've written a book called Why Ukraine Must Win. And one of the theories that you talk about is you say that Zelensky is cleaning up post-Soviet Russian corruption. And you talk about it in terms of détente, which is a relaxation of a strained, relationship. And our history of appeasement. Can you talk about that a little bit? I was reading in your book, you have on page 15, you mentioned George Kennan. And in your book, you quote Kennan, and you said that, the U.S. must adopt a attitudes towards Russia, one of, to be patient but firm in terms of vigilant containment. And I don't think that that is wearing very well right now.
Yeah, good point. Well, let me go back first of all to what you said about the post-Soviet realities in Russia versus Ukraine, because there's significant differences. All of those countries were deeply affected by their Soviet past, and many of the Soviet leaders became the democratic leaders as soon as the changes took place. Literally, they became the president. Um, but the change in Russia um, was pretty much throttled after Yeltsin when Putin took over, and bit by bit he began to build his power. I mean, initially he was relatively successful, but what he did essentially, I mean, as a good KGB operative, he was clearly raised with the communist ideology, deep in his mind. Um, and I think what he did essentially was modify that by embracing the church instead of rejecting it and manipulating the church to use it for his benefits. And of course, manipulating the economy to his own benefit, forgetting about the sort of socialist idealism of communism. And so what he created, in effect, was a fascist state, which he's been running for 24 years now. And that's a huge difference to what's happened in Ukraine, where you've had meaningful, significant elections. You have a lot of debate. Yes, Zelensky's had to deal with some of the legacy of Russian control of Ukraine in the past. For example, the Russian Orthodox Church has been working for the headquarters of the church under Kirill, a former KGB agent in Moscow, and has been providing information to them. So the Ukrainians have had to shut it down as much as they could just to avoid having that fifth column while they're fighting a war with Russia. But more importantly, you can see the difference in the transition in how the Russians are behaving in Ukraine compared to how the Ukrainians are behaving now in Kursk. I mean, the Russians are absolute examples of barbarians, destroying whole cities, raping, pillaging, kidnapping children and taking them to Russia. Every war crime in the book has been committed in tens of thousands of repetitions. The Ukrainians have been completely different in their occupation of Kursk. So I think that says a lot for people. And yes, the young people definitely don't want to live in a communist or fascist state. To come to George Kennan, he has so much influence, and it's almost hard to understand how he did, but he was a big Russophile. He was the first translator for the first ambassador to Russia in 1933. It was called Bullock, sent by FDR when America finally normalized its relationship with the Soviet Union after it was established in 1922. This was the first time. And that period also opened the floodgates to Soviet influence coming into America. And books like Whittaker Chambers' book, Witness, and many other fine books describe what happened, the inflood of many agents, spies, and people alike who actually, many of them had a real belief in the Soviet Union and its ideals. But Kennan spoke Russian fluently, so he was Bullock's translator, and he had a lot to do with Russia. He went back there, and he truly was a Russophile. He said he was never happier than when he visited the home of Tolstoy on one of his visits. And I think that shaped his thinking about the post-World War II reality and what America and the West should do vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. So as you mentioned, he talked about what became known as the containment theory. And basically the idea was we cannot defeat the Soviet Union, so we should come to a sort of compromise. We should try and restrict its expansion, contain it, in other words, but we should not seek to get rid of it, to destroy it, to conquer it. And this became official policy. It became the Truman Doctrine when Truman became president. And we saw the results of this almost immediately. In its first application, the Truman Doctrine was actually quite successful, where America gave something like $400 million to Greece and Turkey both of which were struggling to regain their footing after World War II. Greece was almost overrun by a communist insurgency, literally on the verge of falling to communism, and was rescued partly by this funding. Turkey had other internal problems. But the second important application of the Truman Doctrine was in Korea, and this proved to be what I consider a complete disaster. FDR had agreed with Stalin at Yalta that if the Russians entered the war against Japan to help the Allies, which they did in the last month before the war ended, that they could control North Korea, the Kuril Islands, and some other territories in China. And that's exactly what happened. So the moment they entered the war, they beat the Japanese in so-called Manchukuo. They gave all the weapons they captured to Mao Zedong, and they occupied North Korea. Of course, Stalin's promise was that he would offer democratic elections in all of these countries, including East Europe. And of course, he never did. So when the war in Korea broke out, because basically there was American sort of waffling. I mean, there was a statement made by the Secretary of State. It slipped my mind in January of 1950, where he said that Korea and Taiwan were outside of the American defensive perimeter in Asia. That was a clear signal to Stalin, who at this time, around that time, had acquired nuclear weapons. So he felt he was in a position to support Kim Il-sung to invade the South, and that's what happened. Generals MacArthur and later Clark both told Truman and then Eisenhower that they could win the war in North Korea if they were permitted to destroy the bridges across the Yalu River, over which the Chinese entered the war, first of all, but also which gave sanctuary to the North Koreans. So, of course, Korea was lost, North Korea was lost, and all in the name of saving lives, which, of course, it didn't accomplish. So the pattern was set in Korea of applying containment theory in a way that was disastrous.
Is Biden's pull out of Afghanistan just more of this same type of thing, that it signaled to Putin that it was a green light for him to go ahead and invade Ukraine? Do you see that as a parallel?
Absolutely, and the sort of mentality of of containment is this fear of escalation. You remember in the Vietnam War, the whole talk was we can't escalate, we can't escalate. And Kissinger and Nixon both believed we could not win the war. And it was like Korea. They basically negotiated a failure. And the North Vietnamese, sorry, overran the South. And everybody knows the result of that. Afghanistan was a case where Biden thought, I think, that we could just pull out without any significant consequences. It was a completely irresponsible decision, considering the fact that we hadn't lost any soldiers in the previous 18 months, just maintaining our presence, particularly at Bagram. And now we see it again in Ukraine. This reluctance to give the Ukrainians the weapons they need to win in the name of not escalating, America is not the only one playing this game. I saw an interview with Schultz in 1922 with the New York Times, where he said, "Oh, we can't give them Marders and Leopard tanks because it would escalate the war." Of course, eventually they did. Eventually, we gave them F-16s. But this is when it's very late, when the opportunity is already past. And even now, we're telling Ukraine they can't have long-range ATACMS, or the Storm Shadow can't be used to attack targets in Russia, and so on. That's what I see as the kind of repercussions of this containment mentality that's so deeply planted in Western policy.
It feels to me now that this is really one of Zelensky's biggest battles, aside from the war. I mean, he's gone around since the first month after the war and tried to circle the wagons and rally the troops, not only for weapons, but for the future security of Ukraine and towards bringing Putin to The Hague, having Ukraine ratify the Rome Statute, working in a regional sense to get everyone to condemn Putin and bring him to trial. I think he's done an excellent job. And the troops now in the Kursk area, we see videos of them showing the regular citizens there some of the atrocities that their government is committing upon the Ukrainian people. And I've heard you speak about evil, and it's my understanding that this is more of just a territorial war for Putin. This is really about him waging war on the masses, not only the Ukrainian masses, but the entire world. Why is it that our governments don't see that this is what he is doing and aren't taking the threat seriously enough? Because when you look at it from a right and wrong standpoint, you think that the world would step in and stop the glide bombs and stop Putin, what he's been doing, and remove him. It's astonishing to me. It's stunning to me that this is not happening, and they still have a seat at the UN.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, it's just outrageous. By the way, it was Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State, who made that statement in January 50.
Okay.
Yeah, Putin has actually said what he's about. It shouldn't be a secret, right? In 2005, he said the greatest disaster of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And 3 days before the invasion, on February 21st, 2022, in his speech to the nation, not only did he regret that, but he regretted the way the Soviet Union was established. He criticized Lenin and the Bolsheviks for giving a measure of autonomy to all the constituent states, the 15 constituent states of the Soviet Union, like Ukraine, like Kazakhstan, and so on, Belarus, and so on. He said he gave them too much independence, and that's what lay behind the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. So not only is Putin trying to restore the Soviet Union, he's actually trying to restore the Russian Empire, which has one single authority in Moscow, controlling the whole of the territory. That's his actual agenda, and he makes it absolutely clear. I think part of the problem is that, and part of the problem of containment, is that we look at enemies sort of through our Christian civilizational eyes. In other words, we
Mm-hmm.
tend to be forgiving. We assume that they have motivations similar to ours, that they're not really that bad. They're just afraid. Like the big argument for Putin is, oh, he's so afraid of NATO's expansion. It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. Look what his actions produced. Finland and Sweden joined NATO, a much greater threat to him than ever existed before. That's not his motivation. The reason he's opposed to Ukraine is because he doesn't want it taken out of the territory that he hopes to conquer. It's as simple as that. He wants to take that territory for his own empire building ambitions. Why the West is not willing to just look at that objectively and take it for what it is really impossible for me to understand, because it's so clear. And especially, on the right, and this is another topic you may want to get to, of course, but the conservatives in America don't see that. Why are they so blind? I mean, we had the whole Cold War to learn from.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said seeing it through Christian eyes, because that's exactly what it is. When you think about the fact that 19 people were able to hijack planes and fly them into buildings on September 11th, 19 people pulled that off. And now we have an entire system of TSA people at every airport across the nation. And if you want to get on an airplane, you have to remove your shoes. And it has just become normalized for us.
Yeah.
And, so we do it with our Islamic neighbors as well. We don't, I have learned that it's not how we see them. And this is going to take me into Reagan's point that you also write about in your book. We have to learn how they see us and how they view us.
Yeah.
And in your book, you quote Reagan, where he says, "I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, and label both sides equally at fault, and to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire." And, Reagan was such a class act. And, he was able to achieve a lot, I think. How do you think he was so able to understand the enemy? Do you have any inside ideas about how Reagan was this one person that really understood?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Reagan studied communism very deeply. Many decades ago, I saw a long documentary he made about communism, which really showed the depth of his knowledge about the topic.
Mm.
And he just didn't believe in principle. He didn't believe in containment and in détente. He simply thought they were failed theories, which they were. And the reason is because they didn't recognize the evil in communism, which is why he called it the evil empire. You cannot compromise with evil. You cannot live side by side with evil. It's like the Israelis are discovering with Hamas. They actually cannot live side by side with people determined to destroy them. As you say, you have to understand what the other guys are really up to, what they really think. If you don't, your strategy, your approach to them will always be wrong. Reagan, I like to repeat the joke that about détente. He said it's like a farmer's relationship with his turkey until Thanksgiving. In other words, he's very nice. He feeds him. He's kind. He's gentle. He's a Christian. No, he's Christian until he needs to get rid of him. And that's, in a way, summed up the whole relationship. And the reason Reagan was successful with Gorbachev, you think about Iceland, the conference in Reykjavik, where he refused to compromise on Star Wars, which Gorbachev was desperate to get done because Russia could no longer afford to compete with America. And this is hugely expensive military weapon systems. And Reagan won because of that. Gorbachev had to back down. But it was, I think it's from the real goodness of his character and his ability to see the difference between good and evil. And, his foreign policy was the best ever. We win, they lose. That's the policy we should be forward pursuing. And it was rooted in his belief in America and the virtue of America, which was so deep. In 1988, in the prayer breakfast, he gave a speech about how America had been blessed, such a blessed nation. But he pointed out that blessing was not only for America, but for the world. And I think he truly believed that. He believed that, yes, we are a wonderful, strong, powerful nation with great wealth, but we also have a moral obligation to the world. And he took that very seriously. And I think that's what's missing in Ukraine. That was was missing in Korea, frankly, and in Afghanistan,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. Because the determination to win is the first step in winning. If you're not determined to win, you probably will never win. And that's where you end up with these long drawn out wars. So many people die. So much money is spent on armaments. It's a disaster.
It is a disaster. Um, So have you been what well, I imagine you would be watching Ukraine since the Revolution of Dignity um, in at Maidan Square. Um, did you sense a full scale invasion coming
No,
before
no,
it happened?
no. And Putin's meddling in the elections through Viktor Yanukovych, the president at the time, who eventually resigned and ran away to Moscow, was clear. And it was pretty obvious that he planned to manipulate Ukraine and bring it closer and closer into his orbit through Yanukovych,
Hmm.
and that Maidan uprising put an end to that. So we didn't know, but he actually moved on Crimea when the Olympics was still, it was at the end of the Olympics in Sochi at the time, incredibly. He had everything arranged and prepared for it. Um, so yes, I think he was always looking for a way to implement that, and the Maidan and his outcome, Yanukovych having to leave office is gave him the pretext to act.
I've been to Maidan Square, and it's interesting because it's a shrine now, and
Yeah.
off to the side of it, there's a wall and a brick wall, like a retaining wall, and they have some of the bricks removed from the wall, and in each one of these places is a picture of someone who lost their life at that event in 2013, 2014. And when you stand there and you look at their faces, of the, ordinary average person, it's striking that these people have like a unity, um, and a will to come out and fight this this Russian aggressor. And uh, they they lost their lives there, and they're continuing to lose their lives. It's a shattered country, and when you look into their eyes and you see um, what has happened to them, especially with the young people, they just are dealing with something that they never asked for. And when I came home, I thought, the average American who's thinking about going to happy hour at 5 has no idea, I think, about the sacrifice of others. And so my feelings were very strong towards these people, and I wanted to go and see the country and see what it was like during wartime. And so my question for you is, did you write the book Why Ukraine Must Win, from a geopolitical academic perspective, or do you have an emotional connection to the suffering of those people?
I mean, absolutely. For one thing, living in the Middle East, you see wars. I spent quite a lot of time in Lebanon during the Civil War. Um, but just watching your television, it's the suffering in Ukraine has been sort of incomprehensible. The barbarity of the Russians, if you look into it, is the torture, the torture locations, the raping
Mm,
of families, children in front of parents, parents in front of children, kidnapping. These abuses, uh, we haven't seen anything like this on this scale, really, I think, since World War II, when you saw cities were bombed um, on both sides, but the Allies had to bomb Nazi Germany simply because Hitler would not surrender. It's a completely different scenario. So yes, I feel the suffering of the Ukrainian people and their
mhm,
bravery. Their bravery.
mhm.
I mean, some people have ridiculed Zelensky, but he stood his ground. He could have easily left when Russia, invaded, and they had the tanks on the outskirts of Kiev within a matter of a couple of days. He had every reason, to run and hide if that was his mentality. But he stood and he showed the nation. He said, I need ammunition, not a ride. I think this spirit was very, very important, and you see it continuing in Ukraine almost miraculously. And I think the reason is because the Russians are so barbaric. The big issue in the Maidan uprising was the dispute over whether or not Ukraine should seek membership in the European Union or not. This is a long-standing dispute, and Yanukovych was waffling on that because of Putin's pressure, and that's what led to that uprising. So it's the same thread I think you're pointing to in the spirit of the people. It's very, very clearly pro-Western, pro-Europe, pro-American now. And we should honor that. These are our moral allies, if not our NATO allies. Why not bring Ukraine into NATO? Why shouldn't we? It's a defensive organization, not a aggressive organization. And we should care. And it's really, honestly, some of the leaders, the callous things they say about Ukraine, I don't care about Ukraine, or it's not important to me, it doesn't matter to us. We should care about our own borders before caring about Ukraine's border with Russia. I find these just heartless, cold, cynical statements. They're not. They do no credit to the people who say these things. We have to stand up for the side of right. In the sort of bigger historical picture, the ultimate historical picture of good and evil. We're talking about Cain versus Abel. Russia is a Cain type nation, as are the Hamas terrorists. And we have to stand on the side of Abel, whether it's Ukraine or Israel. This has to be our position. This is America's role in the world.
When you say things, and I mean anybody in general, that other people do not want to hear, or they disagree with, you can tend to become isolated and become, an unpopular person. And this whole Ukrainian situation has really divided the Republicans, I think,
Yeah.
because of this, the propaganda that has come out. And I mean, it was immediate, after the invasion, and it was like it was launched and ready to go. All these attacks on Zelensky about his character and activities, or you have it, and I found that there were many American journalists, and I could name them off, but I won't, who just lapped it up and immediately picked up the ball in this regard and began to spread the most outrageous lies around. But what was even worse than that, Thomas, was that it was as if they wanted to believe it. As if they wanted to believe it. They didn't want to know that Zelensky is a Jewish man who went to law school, and he built a very successful entertainment empire, and that he's, what if he is actually a good person and a great patriot? And I was just, really shocked at the number of people that wanted to believe this, what I refer to as inquirer level journalistic trash. And it's taken, 2 years of the war to get people to, really quiet down about that. But they won't admit that they were wrong. They won't admit that they went down the wrong road. And you still have Tucker Carlson out there, beating the drum and about Ukraine, and finding some other kind of path to just prove that Zelensky was a plant and a corrupt puppet and this kind of thing. It's been shocking to see people like Alex Jones end up on Russian state TV with the worst propagandists that there are out there. And so it's been hard, it's made it harder to reach out to to friends or to people that you know and say, these are lies, and and this is why we need for Ukraine to win. This is how important it is. And that arrogance and that pride is seems to be really loud and proud among the right wing. It's shocking.
I'm with you 100% on that. You would think the Republican Party is, the home of faith, of family, patriotism, morality, goodness. So it's almost inexplicable. But I think one thing that we've learned is how clever and successful Russian propaganda actually is. You see kind of clownish people on their own TV channels making outrageous statements about them being at war with Satan and so on and so forth. But that's not how they influence the West. They influence the West primarily through Westerners. They have their channels. So you talk about Tucker Carlson, he has a huge audience, right? But
Right.
who are the people he has on, like Colonel McGregor,
Mhm.
who simply spouts Russian propaganda about the war, and he brings him back on every single time. But what about alternative voices who actually know what's going on, like a Ben Hodges or a Breedlove or a Petraeus? He doesn't have those people on. So I don't understand that. Don't you really want to know what's going on? It seems not. It seems not, and that is honestly, it's a mystery. Obviously issue once somebody makes a position, they don't want to back down, right? They don't want to be shown to be
Right.
wrong. These people are absolutely wrong. And you have words coming out of the mouth of J.D. Vance, for example. I don't care about Ukraine. I mean, how can you be a responsible leader of the United States and make a statement like that? As a minimum, you should care about the suffering of the people, even if you don't agree with a sort of a reasonable solution, meaning that Ukraine wins. So, this is deeply troubling to me. Do we only care about Americans and American lives? I don't think so. I think
Yeah, I've noticed that there's a tremendous difference between news correspondents like on a network like DW or TVP versus some of the ones we have. We're so personality based and entertainment based. And and now I find myself, absorbing and watching news from these other networks over in the European Union. We are so crass and so sarcastic and so loud and obnoxious and boisterous. And we fed the American public just, gossip rag news. And I think it's really sad because I think that, as a journalist, your job is to, educate the public. And we see that with our leaders. And I don't see that Vance and Trump have the education or the knowledge that even someone like me has. I really don't. And the same thing with Kamala Harris. Um, there's this sentiment going on right now, this utopia that they want to build, and we're going to be, a kinder, gentler nation, and we're just going to have love and joy and peace, and that's not the reality that I live in. And so it's what the American public is being fed is such a disservice to us and to the world. And I feel like we're fighting we're fighting that as well. So I know that you have ideas about how to, try to reach people and turn the tide. And we have allies, uh, Smith and Toth, right? Mark Toth and John Sweet. John Sweet is his name. And we have Breedlove and Hodges. And there's quite a collection of everyone whose voices are relevant and they're powerful. And the other point that I want to make is that I don't think I really honestly don't think that Putin realized, or maybe he didn't care, that the average Ukrainian was going to have a cell phone and they were going to be whipping it out and filming what was going on in Bucha,
Mm.
and that they were going to be able to organize an army of people that were going to counter all of the Russian propaganda. And I really honestly think that this is one of the best weapons that we have is open source information and open source intelligence. Because I can tell you also too that people like Steve Bannon and Alex Jones and some of these other people, they have not seen this community coming either. And the power of data that can be harnessed and that can be shared to counter disinformation, I feel we have more power in that now than we've ever had before.
Yeah, I mean, the question is how to challenge it and distribute it, channel it and distribute it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, you're right. Um, the the conservative side, you know, you think about the people with the big platforms, like honestly, Donald Trump is top of the pile. Um, you know, if you think about some of the statements he's made about Ukraine, they're so flippant. Like, you know, I could end that war in a day, or if I had been in power, yes, Putin would have never invaded. Yeah, okay, that may be true, but it's irrelevant now. So that doesn't amount to a policy that can give confidence to the Ukrainians or the world that we stand with them, that we're going to make sure that they win. So really, you know, the on the conservative side of the fence, it's really inexcusable to be a Putin mouthpiece at this point, with everything we've seen, all of his aggression, his empire building, his brutality. There's really no excuse for that. And I mean, the ideal thing would be able to get to Donald Trump himself, but he seems to be surrounded with people, you know, whispering Russian propaganda in his ear. I hope he's wiser and has better instincts. I mean, he seems to have very good instincts, but it's so important in Ukraine in the same way that the collapse of the Soviet Union was, you know, earth shaking in a positive way. We need something similar, not only for Ukraine's sake, but for the sake of the rest of the world, for China to pay attention, you know, for the other bad actors in the world, whether it's Venezuela, Nicaragua, Syria,
Mm-hmm.
Afghanistan, Iran, all of these totalitarians need to be put on notice that we don't accept this type of regime, this type of oppression of individuals. And, you know, we have the power to put it to an end. It's just we have to have the resolve, the determination, the vision to do it. So we truly need leaders who can do that.
Well, and we don't know if we have that. It may take a bigger event, like you say, something earth shattering, because, evidently across the pond, it's not earth shattering enough to us over here. We have life is so good for us over
Yeah.
here. So what do you see yourself doing, going forward? Do you have some projects going on or some activities that you're engaged in with Ukraine?
Yeah, I'm not, obviously I'm trying to spread my book around. It's been translated into Slovenian. A former prime minister of Slovenia liked it very much, and that's Melania's language, although I don't think she's got a copy. And in Polish, it's been translated into Polish. And you know, every chance I have, I speak about it to different groups and individuals, whoever whoever's interested. To me, it's such a clear-cut case of a moral imperative for us to be involved. So, yeah. And
Well,
you
I
know,
would I would encourage you to do an audio book.
yeah,
Because I talk to authors all the time, and sometimes they complain, narrative nonfiction is not is almost becoming an obscure genre out there. And so, and I talk to a lot of other people who are really into listening to audiobooks.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
you know,
there's also the sort of big picture, which is, the situation of Ukraine within the Cold War reality, but also within the reality of the threat of Marxism in general after the fall of the Soviet Union, primarily through neo-Marxist postmodernism, which is, the so-called woke cancel culture that is destroying our education and our civilization. There's Islamic radicalism, which has to be dealt with on a ideological basis. So there's a lot to be done, and I'm interested in all of those things, excuse me, and addressing all of those things through my books.
I agree. The Students for Justice in Palestine issue with, acting as a partner with Hamas and the communist groups that have gained so much control over campuses, here in the United States, groups like the National Lawyers Guild who, hold communist ideologies and want to reform our entire justice system. There's so many other problems that we have. There's definitely going to be a lot to write about, and there's a lot to counter in our society if we have any hope of turning it around. Um, I have my radar on those subject matters as well, and the Marxism that is global, and how strong it is in the language that it uses. And I've even seen that in Ukraine in my travel over there as well. It just seems to be everywhere. And I guess my last question is, and I'm glad you brought that up because we can come back again and do this again, and we can talk about that all day. Um, you mentioned one of the things that you mentioned was when you're talking about the peace process, and I do believe that the peace process is something that has to be worked on and in a roadmap um, designed for. It's not just going to fall out of the sky, and something that needs to be thought about once there's a ceasefire or some the war is decided. But you said that Russia must be made to admit that it has lied about Ukraine for decades. And I of course agree with that. Is that type of language, is that something that you have ever seen written into negotiation agreements and peace agreements?
Uh, I doubt it. But one thing that's useful, I think, to remember is this. Victor Davis Hanson puts this extremely well, but he pointed out after World War One that the Allies did not extract an unconditional surrender from Germany, only an armistice. And what happened after the armistice was that Germany got to keep much of its territory that it had captured, and the military establishment was not dismantled. So, of course, 21 years later, after Hitler had rearmed the country and re-energized the population, they went back to war again. In the Second World War, in contrast, the Allies demanded an unconditional surrender. They occupied all of Germany, and they made darn sure that the German war machine was dismantled and Germany was reformed. They did the same thing in Japan, by the way, exactly the same thing with MacArthur in Japan. And the result of that was that Germany and Japan both became completely different countries. So we're not in that position with Russia, where we can control Russia and dismantle Russia. But one problem in Russia is that the Soviets never had to face the consequences of what they'd done. There was no Nuremberg trial for the Soviet leaders, which is why you have all the bad actors pretending to become Democrats and actually becoming fascists
Mhm.
in a new regime. So I'm not sure what that'll take from Russia, but it'll take some sort of coming to terms with that whole history, I believe. Um, they need to deal with it internally. And you see many young Russians who have escaped Russia, for example, living in exile, who see this and they realize that Russia has to be transformed fundamentally.
I agree. And I've talked to others who, there's many experts who say the same thing, that there needs to be a real internal change. So, what do you think it's going to take to unseat Putin, and how do you think that we could pull that off?
You know, he's a big bluffer, right?
Yeah,
He's constantly threatening nuclear attacks, all of which looks a bit silly after Ukrainians actually walked into Russia and started occupying their land. Nothing has happened. He's a bluffer, and this is an old Soviet tactic. Stalin used it all the time. The Soviet Union's leaders all used it, bluffing to threatening to use nuclear weapons in particular. That's his part of his nature. But the reality in Russia is getting grimmer and grimmer and grimmer. Not only did all those, I don't know, 1, 2, 3 million young people, educated, generally talented professionals, leave the country, and many of them probably for good. But the exports of oil and gas are down like 2/3. China and Turkey have cut off their banking facilities, so they can't trade with those countries. Um, Inflation is high. The ruble is losing its value. There's a whole host of problems, and the Ukrainians are doing a great job of exacerbating them by bombing their oil refineries, their oil storage facilities, their gas pipelines. They're wearing Putin's regime down. And I've heard quite a few projections that sound right to me, that the ability of Russia to replace the armor it's losing on the front line will begin to diminish significantly next year, in large part because they no longer have access to the spare parts they need. They don't have apparently their military industrial complex is short 160,000 workers itself. So Putin is trying to maintain a face of strength, but his country is crumbling. And at the end of the day, he's going to have to face that. And I think that's when he's going to lose power. Somebody may push him out. It's quite likely that other oligarchs or other power centers will push him out. And, this whole war is proved to be a disaster for him.
yeah, it's humiliating. It's got to, I mean, there's got to be some effect happening there.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of shocking things that have happened that he never expected. In his prideful mind, he was just going to waltz in and take Kiev in 3 days. And, you know, here we are. And now Ukraine is occupying their territory. It's humiliating for him. So I do hope that there is an internal change for Russia, and I hope it's for the better. And I hope that the smart people are going to prevail.
Yeah.
And it's been a learning experience, I think, for everyone. I mean, when you're an outsider, and you're looking in and you're watching it and you absorb as much of it that's going on. It's been a learning experience for the United States as well, and I hope that it has woken more of us up to our enemies and our threats that we have. That there are people out there that just want to kill us, and we have to do something to defeat that.
Yeah.
So that is where we are. So, Thomas Cromwell, thank you for coming on and talking with me today, and let's do it again soon.
Well, let me just show the book in case anybody's interested in reading
Please
the book.
do.
Why Ukraine Must Win.
Everyone go out. You can get it on Amazon. Everybody go out and get the book. I've got my copy, but I can't hold it up in front of the camera because I have a blurred background and it won't show, but I definitely have my copy.
Yeah.
And it's an excellent book, and I like how you've just laid it all out, and we've got to learn from our past, and you lay out how the mistakes of the past
Yeah.
are really almost like on replay right now.
Yeah.
And at some point, we need to stop making the same mistakes of the past and get on the right side of things, or we just might have a nuclear war.
Mm.
I think Putin has some allies that they don't care. I mean, Ramzan Kadyrov,
Mm.
he's happy to be a martyr, and let's just go ahead and set off a nuclear war and take everybody out of action.
Yeah.
That's some
Yeah.
of the people that are around Putin. These are very dangerous, brutal people.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Lauren. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, and we'll see
Yeah.
you soon.
Okay. Thank you.